Hi, my name is Ace Jordan. I'm the executive producer, writer, and director of Silent Retreat.
How did Silent Retreat begin?
It started back in about 2006, 2007, when I first met one of the story writers, Tearlon. I had actually had a meeting with somebody who was representing me. I was a screenwriter at the time, and he told me that he had read one of my horror scripts, and he said, you know, you really need to kind of develop a niche as a writer, and you should probably stick with horror because you're good at writing horror. So I started doing some research as to how I would go about making an independent film. So when I met Taryn, it was right around the same time that she told me about this story called Shatter that she had wrote with her friend Heather. And it just felt perfect. It was like, I thought, well, we could work on this. We could take this and turn the short story into a feature film that had all the elements that I was looking for to make my first film.
What was your most rewarding moment on set?
One that really touched me personally was when the young actor Aidan Flynn, he came up to me. It was his last day in Big Bear, and he said, "Here, I made this for you." And he drew this little crayon picture of me, and it made me realize why I was doing this, because you know, he's kind of looking at me as the way I was as a little kid watching movies and looking at filmmakers and wanting to be them. And I'm not saying that he wants to be me, but I could see the parallels.
What's a memorable moment that turned out better than you thought?
The scene I think that turned out better than I thought it would definitely be the driving scenes that are in the beginning and at the end of the production, because we actually shot those as pickup days, and we kind of had shrunk the crew down to like a skeleton crew, and we were doing kind of everything guerrilla style, and the footage actually turned out really good, and I think it actually added a level to it.
Is Silent Retreat a horror film?
By today's standards, I think it would be classified as a psychological thriller, but honestly, I always thought of it as a horror film. It has all those cliche elements that are in modern horror films. And part of the fun of the film is that you get to see those type of cliches, but we always try to put a different spin on it, where you see something that you recognize, but it never really goes in the direction that you thought it would.
Which subgenre does it fit in?
It's a cabin in the woods, it's a whodunit, it's a haunted house movie to a degree, and it's also kind of a slasher in the sense that there isn't any slashing, but it goes through that type of progression where certain characters kind of die off one by one till you get down to the main character and the main villain in a final confrontation. So I think I incorporated several elements of different horror subgenres in one, but you never can really pin it on one or the other. They're all kind of synergized together.
Watching the film, I noticed that you never actually see anybody cutting anybody. In a lot of horror movies, there's a close-up of the knife slitting the throat or the tongue being cut off. Was that a conscious decision on your part?
I shot it a certain way to kind of keep a certain mystery to it. I kind of wanted to go from tongue being in the mouth to tongue being out of the mouth and leave that little part of how it was done a mystery, because the mystery is scarier than actually seeing how it's done. So that the audience has to kind of fill that in, of how they were able to do that. And there is a kind of a clue in one of the articles about how it was done originally. My goal is always to make violence in movies realistic, because if you make it realistic, it has the same type of visceral response that you get from seeing violence in real life. I want the audience to be disgusted by it the same way as if you see somebody getting hurt in real life. So when you see violence in Silent Retreat, I want the audience to be kind of repelled by it.
Favorite horror film?
The Shining and The Exorcist are probably the two best horror films I've ever seen.
What about a favorite filmmaker?
When I was younger, I really was into Spielberg movies, you know, like Raiders of the Lost Ark, Goonies, which actually he didn't direct, but and then later Jurassic Park. There was a lot of films that he did that were, there's several references of the film in the movie to Jurassic Park. And then as I got to be a teenager, an older teenager, I got really into the work of Stanley Kubrick and his attention to detail.
Who was one of your favorite characters in Silent Retreat?
I'd say my favorite character in Silent Retreat is Zach. I believe he's the most complex. He's both a very kind and decent person, and he's both a malicious and deceptive maybe not openly deceptive, but he kind of symbolizes the duality of man in a sense that he's both the dark and the light.
Zach, hero or villain?
It's left to interpretation as to whether or not he's a good guy or a bad guy, because in reality he's both. He's both those things. He's protective, he's nurturing in one hand, and the other hand he's kind of sadistic and violent and dangerous. I do think overall that deep down I think he's good. His revenge, I wouldn't say it's justified, but you can understand his motivations. It's not like he goes out and targets random people and takes pleasure in torturing them or killing them or harming them. He specifically targets people who he feels have wronged him or have wronged others and who deserve some sort of punishment.
So who is the real villain in Silent Retreat?
There's almost two villains. I would say the obvious choice is Mr. Warren, but there's also Dr. Rexif, who ran the hospital. And all the bad stuff that went on at that hospital, he's responsible for, either directly or indirectly. And the hospital is kind of what pushed Zach on his path. So I would say that Mr. Warren is kind of like the soldier villain, whereas Dr. Rexif is like the brain villain.
Real horror versus movie horror.
Pretty much from Silent Retreat to all the stuff that I am writing and developing now, it's all kind of inspired from real life. They may not be taken from true stories that have happened and we're recreating what happened, but they're inspired by things that are just awful that happen in real life. And to me, that's a lot more terrifying than things that I can come up with or some other writer like, I don't know, Stephen King can come up with. As bad as that stuff is, I don't think it ever compares to what people have already done in real life. And it really disturbs me that as dark as the stuff I write is, I can never come up with things that are as bad as what people have already done. And that's a really depressing fact of life.
Favorite scene in Silent Retreat?
I think it's the scene between Joel and Lyra, when Joel confronts her about seeing Zach and Lyra on the porch. To me, it was kind of a joy to watch her completely manipulate the situation and just use her skillful tongue to lie her way out of that situation. Not only to where she gets away with it, but she actually kind of completely reverses the situation to whereas now Joel feels bad, and that's kind of what leads Silent Retreat down the dark course that it takes.
Describe filmmaking techniques.
The film takes place over 3 days, and there's also a flashback day. And each day that action takes place, we use a different kind of filmmaking technique. When we first arrive at Tearlon on day one, we use a lot of smooth camera tracking shots, smooth dolly shots to kind of have a nice, smooth, warm, welcome feeling. And then as things start to progress on day two, we started using what's called the burrito rig, which is basically putting the camera on top of an unstable piece of cloth, so you kind of get this little handheld effect, but it's much more subtle than handheld. So the camera is just very slightly rocking, and it symbolizes that the story is kind of transcending into a shakier place, a more dangerous place. And then on the last day, we utilized almost entirely handheld. Everything was handheld, everything was shaky, but not so much that you would notice it. It was just shaky enough to give each scene a little bit of intensity. And then when we did all the flashback scenes that take place at the psychiatric hospital, the camera was always locked off. It was like you're trapped, you're in prison, you can't move. We're locked on what we're seeing. So I incorporated those 4 different type of techniques over the course of the different events.
Was it a conscious effort for you to have the flashback scenes and not have those scenes in chronological order?
I think I used nonlinear storytelling techniques for 2 reasons. The first one is just I kind of like stories, like the novel structure, where sometimes things don't always develop in a linear order. And I also like stories where you follow a story and you follow characters and you get to a certain point, but you learn new information that had happened in the past. And that information that you find out changes everything up to that point. So I kind of wanted to keep the audience guessing. So if they're like 3/4 of the way through the film and they think they've got it figured out, well then there's a flashback to an earlier scene that changes all the information that they had gotten to that point, and now they're lost again, and now they're trying to figure it out once again, and they're kind of forced to play detective in this whole kind of crazy murder mystery type thing.
Why did Rita meet the fate that she did?
I believe Rita met the fate that she did based upon Zach's interpretation of who she was. Now, she may have been totally innocent in everything that happened, or she may be in kind of a secondary participant in Mr. Warren's crimes, because as a member of that family, they chose to use their influence to protect him, to give him a life, which possibly allowed him to commit even more crimes.
Practical versus computer FX.
I strongly prefer the practical effects. There's just something about practical effects, in particular with some of the scenes that we did in Silent Retreat. Most notably, I would probably be the bear trap scene, and what I liked about that so much is that by using really well-made practical effects, we could point a 5K camera and do a close-up of an effect, and it still looks disturbing, it still looks real. I think there's a tendency to get a little lazy when it comes to CGI, and it's not that I don't hate CGI, I just believe in order to make a film better, you have to use it sparingly.
How do you feel about kids in horror?
I believe kids have a very important place in horror because they kind of represent innocence. And when you see a kid that age, a very normal looking kid, all-American looking kid, a very sweet looking kid, and he's already been corrupted by the darkness of the real world, of humanity, I think that's truly a scary thing.